Picture an airliner that's already been circling over a capital city for a long time. Mechanically sound, engines running, 121 people on board, and it says nothing. Fighter jets pull in close and see an empty captain's seat, a motionless first officer, rows of people in masks. Nobody is at the controls. What turned an ordinary Helios Airways flight from Cyprus to Prague into this dead ship flying in circles? No bomb, no storm, no mechanical failure. Just a chain of small things, a forgotten switch, two identical alarms, and an invisible enemy called hypoxia, and one man who tried to fix it all to the very end. The 14th of August, 2005, that morning. Over the Aegean Sea, in a clear sky on the outskirts of Athens, an airliner is flying in circles, a big white and blue Boeing 737. Holding its altitude, engines humming steadily, navigation lights blinking just as they should. From the ground, it's an ordinary plane on an ordinary flight, except that for several hours now, it hasn't answered a single call from air traffic control. Two Greek F-16 fighters move in toward it. They were scrambled on alert. A silent foreign airliner is circling over the capital, and nobody knows what to expect from it. The pilots edge in carefully, match its speed, and peer into the cockpit through the glass. What they see is impossible to take in. The captain's seat is empty. The first officer has slumped forward, motionless, onto the instrument panel. He doesn't react to the fighter beside him, or to anything at all. The F-16 pilot drops back a little and looks into the windows of the passenger cabin. There, rows of people. They don't move. Above their heads hang the oxygen masks that have dropped from the ceiling, swaying gently in time with the flight. The plane is completely sound. The turbines are spinning, the hydraulics are working, the autopilot is flying the machine along its programmed path. But inside all this huge, obedient technology, there isn't a single person who could control it. The airliner flies on its own, like a wound-up toy, with no idea that a silent tragedy has already played out inside it. The Greek pilots are powerless. Fly alongside, they can. Watch, they can. But reach out and grab the controls, they cannot. All that's left is to escort the doomed machine and wait. What drove an ordinary morning flight to this point? To understand, we have to go back a few hours, to a calm morning on Cyprus. Larnaca Airport, early morning of that same day. On the apron, a plane belonging to Helios Airways, a small Cypriot budget carrier, is being prepared for departure. Flight number 522 is to fly its usual route, from Cyprus to Athens and then onward to Prague. Some of the passengers are flying as far as the Greek capital, others all the way to the end, to the Czech Republic. The aircraft that will fly this route is a Boeing 737-300 with the registration 5 Bravo Delta Bravo Yankee. The plane rolled off the line in 1998, and inside the airline it was given the affectionate name Olympia. A reliable, time-tested short-haul airliner, the kind that fly by the thousands all over the world. That morning, 121 people board the plane, 115 passengers and 6 crew members. Among the passengers are whole families, flying off on holiday or to see relatives. 22 of them are children. An ordinary summer load, ordinary faces, suitcases in the cargo hold. In the cockpit are 2 experienced pilots. The captain, a German, Hans-Jürgen Merten, 59 years old. A contract pilot with 35 years behind him, almost 17,000 flight hours, more than 5,000 of them on Boeings of this type. Beside him, the first officer, a Cypriot, Pambos Charalambos, 51 years old, with around 7,500 flight hours. Neither of them is short on experience. The weather is clear and calm. You couldn't ask for better. The forecast is clean, the route familiar, the plane cleared for departure. On the face of it, this is one of hundreds of routine flights that lift off over the Mediterranean every day and land calmly wherever they're going. Nothing this morning hints at disaster. Not the controllers, not the crew, not the passengers suspect that the fatal mistake has already been made. It wasn't made now, and it wasn't made here. It was made the night before, in the silence of an empty hangar, by the hands of a man who wanted to do everything for the best. To understand what happened in that hangar, you need to know one detail about this particular aircraft. Olympia had been temperamental for a long time. Passengers and crews had complained more than once about a strange noise and problems with the cabin air conditioning and pressurization system. In the 10 weeks before the disaster alone, this system on the plane had been checked or repaired 7 times. The machine seemed to be sending signals that something was wrong with its breathing. The night before the fatal flight, the plane was rolled into the hangar once again. Another complaint, a suspicious noise connected to the pressurization. A ground engineer set about checking the cabin's air tightness, whether there was a leak anywhere, whether the fuselage was holding pressure. To carry out such a check, the pressurization system has to be run in manual mode. In the cockpit, on the overhead panel, there's a small switch that sets the operating mode of the pressurization. It has several positions, and the 2 main ones are automatic and manual. In normal flight, it sits in the auto position. Then the system itself maintains comfortable pressure in the cabin, no matter how high the plane climbs. For his test, the engineer moved this switch to the manual position. He did his job, found and fixed the problem, signed off the paperwork. But in one thing, the most important thing of all, something went wrong. After the check, the pressurization mode switch was apparently never returned to the auto position. It stayed where it was, in manual. In itself, a tiny bit of carelessness. One small toggle in the wrong position among hundreds of instruments and buttons. In a dark hangar, at the end of a night shift, it's easy to overlook. The engineer switched off the lights and left, confident that everything was in order. But this forgotten switch became the fatal error. In manual mode, the pressurization system doesn't work on its own. It needs the pilot's constant attention. And the morning crew has no idea that they now have to watch over it by hand. Between the mistake and the disaster stood one last barrier, the pre-flight checks. In the morning, Merton and Charalambous climb into the cockpit. Before every flight, pilots are required to go through a checklist, a long list of items that are read out and confirmed aloud. This is aviation's main line of defense. Even if a person has forgotten something, the checklist forces them to verify it again. Among the dozens of items is the position of that very pressurization switch. By the rules, the crew has to confirm the state of the pressurization system not once, but at least 3 times. First, during pre-flight preparation, while still on the stand. Then, in the check after engine start. And finally, in the check after takeoff, when the plane has begun its climb. 3 separate moments, 3 chances to notice that the toggle is not where it's supposed to be. And all 3 times that chance is missed. The pilots run through the checklist items, but their eyes slide right past. In the familiar routine, hand and eye expect to see auto, and the brain seems to fill in the picture it wants. Neither of the 2 registers that the switch is actually in the manual position. Why it happened, no one can say for certain anymore. Maybe the check was rushed and done by rote. Maybe both of them were simply used to it always being on auto and never really looked. The investigation would later note dryly, the crew overlooked the state of the pressurization at all 3 checkpoints in a row. That is the terrifying nature of disasters like this. Not a single crude, obvious mistake. Only a chain of tiny lapses, each of which, on its own, seemed harmless. The night engineer, the morning crew, every link fell into one fatal line. And so, Olympia taxis out to the runway. In its cockpit, on the overhead panel, a small switch sits quietly in the wrong position. While the plane is on the ground, this means nothing. But the moment the machine climbs to altitude, that toggle will turn into a deadly threat to everyone on board. The engines spool up to takeoff power. 7 minutes past 9 in the morning. Flight 522 rolls down the runway at Larnaca, lifts off the ground, and climbs into the sky. The takeoff goes perfectly. The machine responds, builds speed and altitude. The coast and the blue sea drift away beneath the wing. To all appearances, a flawless start to the flight. But inside the cabin, the invisible is unfolding. In manual mode, the pressurization barely pumps any air into the fuselage. The plane climbs higher. The air outside grows thinner, and the air inside thins out exactly the same way. The cabin isn't building pressure the way it should. The cabin altitude, that is, the altitude that corresponds to the pressure inside the plane, creeps upward along with the real flight altitude. Only a few minutes pass. At about 12,000 feet, a sharp, intermittent alarm suddenly sounds in the cockpit. This is the cabin altitude warning going off. The system is reporting that the pressure inside has dropped to a dangerous level. In essence, it's an alarm screaming. It's becoming impossible to breathe in here. Descend immediately. You'd think everything was clear. You hear the alarm, you begin an emergency descent to a safe altitude. But here, a treacherous technical detail comes into play, one built into the very design of the plane. The sound of this cabin altitude warning exactly matches another alarm. With the same intermittent horn, the plane tells the crew of an improper configuration before takeoff, that the flaps, or something else, are set wrong. Two warnings about completely different dangers sound absolutely identical. And so the pilots hear a familiar horn. Their minds reach for the familiar association. They've heard this sound 1,000 times on the ground while preparing for takeoff. But the plane is already in the air, having long since reached altitude. A familiar alarm at an unfamiliar moment throws them off. Instead of saving the plane, the crew starts trying to guess what is even happening. The logic that betrayed the crew seems at first glance ironclad. The takeoff configuration warning, by its very nature, can only sound on the ground. At the moment the pilot pushes the throttles forward on the takeoff roll, while the plane isn't ready to fly. In the air, at altitude, such an alarm makes no sense and simply shouldn't occur. So when that same sound rings out high above the sea, it means something entirely different, a critical loss of pressurization. But to understand that, you have to switch in a fraction of a second from the familiar explanation to the alarming, unobvious one. And that is the hardest thing of all for a person to do, especially when he's convinced that takeoff is long behind him and everything is going normally. Captain Merton and the first officer cling to the version. Something's wrong with the system, probably a minor fault. Merton gets on the radio to the controller and reports a problem with the air conditioning. The word pressurization is never spoken. The crew is thinking of something else. They're looking for a fault in the cooling and ventilation system, not a deadly loss of pressure. Other warning lights make things worse. On the instrument panel, one after another, warnings light up connected to the cabin behaving abnormally. For example, an equipment overheat indicator, because without air pressure the electronics cool less effectively. For the bewildered crew, this is just a fresh batch of cryptic signals, leading their thinking even further astray. The pilots dig through the manuals, talk it over, try to find the cause. They're busy with a task, but the wrong one. Precious minutes, which would have been enough for a life-saving descent, drain away on the search for a non-existent air conditioning fault. And the most frightening part is that time is working against them not only on the clock. With every minute at this altitude, thinking becomes harder. They don't realize it yet, but their own bodies have already begun to fail. It isn't the air conditioning that's the problem. What's bringing them down is hypoxia, oxygen starvation. For the human brain to work normally, it needs a constant supply of oxygen. At high altitude, the air is thin, and the oxygen in each breath becomes critically scarce. The body begins to starve, that is, hypoxia. But the most dangerous thing about it isn't that it kills, but the way it does it. This isn't suffocation, where a person gasps and fights for air. Hypoxia creeps up quietly and deceptively. Its first signs are a mild euphoria, warmth, a groundless calm. Thoughts slow down, reactions dull, sober judgment slips away. And, most terrifying of all, the person himself doesn't notice it. He feels that everything is fine, that he's thinking clearly, but he's already incapable of making the right decision. This is exactly what is happening in the cockpit of Flight 522. The pilots don't realize that the air around them is almost devoid of oxygen. They keep fiddling with the instruments, but their movements grow slower, and their thoughts ever more muddled. A radio record survives of how quickly clarity was slipping away. Captain Merton got on the radio to the Helios base on Cyprus to discuss the baffling fault. At the other end of the line was a company engineer, and this engineer, working through the problem, asked the captain a direct, crucial question about the pressurization mode switch. He literally asked the very thing that could have saved everyone. But Merton, already in the grip of hypoxia, doesn't answer that question with anything to the point. His mind is already clouded. He doesn't seize on the clue lying right in front of him. The chance is lost, perhaps the last real chance. The connection breaks off. In the cockpit, two men slowly lose touch with reality. And beyond the cockpit door, in the cabin, by this point a drama of its own has already played out. When the pressure dropped below the critical mark, the automatics kicked in. From the ceiling panels above the seats, yellow oxygen masks dropped down. This happens without any input from the pilots. The system itself understands that there isn't enough air and hands out the life-saving equipment. The passengers reach for the masks, press them to their faces, as the safety briefing teaches. But here lies a cruel trap. These masks aren't connected to a large oxygen supply. Each of them is fed by a small chemical generator, and it's designed to last only a short time, about 12 minutes. 12 minutes is not a safety margin. It's exactly as long as the crew is supposed to need to put the plane into an emergency descent and drop to a safe altitude of about 10,000 feet. There's already enough air to breathe without the masks. The whole system is built on one assumption, that the pilots are conscious and taking the machine down. But on Flight 522, nobody begins a descent. The plane keeps climbing higher. The masks in the cabin dutifully give up their oxygen, but the minutes melt away and there's still no life-saving descent. When the generators run dry, the people in the cabin are left to breathe the same, thin, almost empty air as the pilots. Consciousness fades across the entire plane, quietly and inexorably. One by one, the people are overtaken by oblivion. Without screams, without panic in the usual sense. Hypoxia doesn't even let them feel real fear. At 20 minutes past 9, at an altitude of about 29,000 feet, Captain Merton gets on the radio with the controller for the last time. After that, silence. The radio answers no more. The last waking person in the cockpit falls quiet. The plane is left alone with the autopilot, and now only the machine knows where to fly. The electronics never lose consciousness. Engaged back during the climb, the autopilot keeps carrying out its program with cold precision. It brings the plane up to its assigned flight level, around 34,000 feet, and carefully levels it off in horizontal flight. The route led Flight 522 by way of Athens. The plane faithfully flies all the way to a point over the Greek capital, to a navigation waypoint laid into the flight plan. And then comes the thing the autopilot is programmed to do in a situation like this. Having reached the point where contact with the controller and the descent were supposed to begin, the airliner enters a holding pattern and starts flying in circles. It will circle here, obediently waiting for a command that no one will ever give. And down below, on the ground, anxiety is mounting. The controllers at the Athens Center wait for the flight to make contact, but the airwaves are silent. They call the plane again and again on different frequencies. 19 times they try to reach the crew of 522. 19 times the answer is emptiness. From the outside, the picture is bizarre. A perfectly sound airliner with 100 people on board, calmly tracing circles over one of the largest airports in Europe. The engines are running, altitude and heading are holding. On radar, it looks completely normal, and at the same time, it's deaf and dumb, as if no one were at the controls, because there really is no one there. The hours pass. There's still enough fuel in the tanks for now. Minute after minute drains away into nothing. Inside, more than 100 motionless people. Outside, everything is mundane, and that mundaneness only makes the picture more terrible. It can't go on like this for long. A silent foreign plane over the capital is no longer just a puzzle for the controllers. It's a matter of national security, and the answer to it will soon rise into the sky with the roar of afterburners. From an airbase, the alert flight is scrambled, 2 F-16 fighters. The pilot's task is simple in words and impossible in essence. Catch up with the unidentified aircraft, look it over, and figure out what's going on. A technical fault, a radio failure, or something worse. Around noon, the pilots reach their target. They find the white and blue Boeing 737 cutting circles, and they move in cautiously. A fighter is a far faster and more nimble machine, and the pilot carefully tucks in alongside the bulk of the passenger airliner, matching its speed. One look through the glass, and the theory of a failed radio collapses. No one is flying the machine. The first officer doesn't react to a fighter just a few meters away from him. This is no longer a technical glitch. This is something far worse. In the cabin, the same terrible stillness. No one is waving. No one is looking out the windows. No one is trying to signal. The huge plane is full of people, but they all seem to be in an unbreakable sleep. The Greek pilots report what they've seen to the ground. But there's nothing they can do. A fighter can't latch onto the airliner, can't hand it the controls, can't force it to descend. They're left with one role only: witnesses. The disaster is unfolding before their eyes, slowly, hour by hour, and there's nothing they can do to stop it. And yet, amid all this stillness, one last hope flickers. The fighters stay close to the aircraft, and their presence is more than just observation. If by some chance anyone inside is still alive, anyone able to come to a window, he'll see the fighters. And there really is still someone like that on board. This man's name was Andreas Prodromou, a young flight attendant. He turned out to be the only person on board who stayed conscious for an incredibly long time. The secret was oxygen. While the passengers breathed from the failing masks above their seats, Prodromou used the portable oxygen bottles, the ones the crew has on hand for moving around the cabin. Those bottles gave him a few extra minutes of clarity, where everyone else had sunk into oblivion. Prodromou had something ordinary flight attendants didn't, a British commercial pilot's license. He knew how to fly an airplane, but there was a bitter caveat. He had never been trained specifically on the Boeing 737. The huge airliner with its dozens of systems was a foreign, unfamiliar machine to him. In the final minutes of the flight, Prodromou makes his way into the cockpit. He sees the same thing the F-16 pilots see, his colleagues unconscious. He sits down in the captain's seat. Before controls he has never truly flown. In front of him are the instruments and levers of a machine he knows only from the cabin. But there's almost no time left, and it's not Prodromou's fault. While the plane circled over Athens for hours, the engines burned fuel, and the tanks emptied nearly to the bottom. Around noon, just as he takes the seat, the left engine falls silent. Its fuel has run out. Thrust on one side disappears. Prodromou tries to act. He sees the F-16 fighter beyond the glass and signals to the pilot, waving his hand, letting him know that there's a living person on board, someone who is fighting. The Greek pilot notices the movement and waves back. For a brief moment, a thread of human contact stretches between the two cockpits. But what could one flight attendant, even with a pilot's license, do against a dying airliner, untrained on the type, almost out of fuel? Did he have even a single real chance? That question would haunt everyone who came to know his story. The circumstances were stacked against him in every way. The radio was still set to the Larnaca frequency, that distant point the flight had left in the morning. To reach the Athens controllers, he had to find and dial in the right frequency in an unfamiliar cockpit. He doesn't manage to do it in time, and yet he tries to call out. The flight recorder that captures sound in the cockpit preserved his voice. On the recording, 5 desperate distress calls, the word Mayday spoken 5 times. The international signal of mortal danger, sent out into airwaves that no one on the right frequency can hear. The cry of a man left alone with a dying machine and 100 silent people at his back. And the plane is already physically doomed. Without the thrust of one engine, it begins to lose altitude. Then the fuel runs out for the second engine too, and it falls silent as well. And now, Olympia is just a many-ton mass of metal, gliding down with no thrust at all. Holding such a plane, stripped of its engines, is a task for the most seasoned pilot on a familiar type. Prodromou has neither the necessary skills, nor the altitude, nor the time to set things right in any way. The airliner sinks unstoppably toward the ground. At 3 minutes past noon, it all ends. Flight 522 slams into the hills near the village of Grammatico, north of Athens. Almost 3 hours have passed since takeoff. Almost 3 hours of a flight that nothing could stop any longer. There were no survivors, not one. All 121 people, whole families, children, the crew, and among them Andreas Prodromou, who fought to his last breath to save what could no longer be saved. The plane's 3-hour silence now had to be explained, and the task fell to those who know how to read the history of a disaster from wreckage and recordings. The investigation was taken up by the Greek Air Accident Investigation Board, the AAIASB. The first thing they did was find the 2 black boxes in the hills near Grammatico, the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder. At first, the picture seemed almost impossible. The plane was perfectly sound. The engine stopped only because the fuel ran out. But that's just the ending. The main question was different. Why did a healthy crew on a sound machine stay silent for almost 3 hours and fail to react at all until the tanks ran dry? The investigators pieced the answer together bit by bit. The recordings, the inspection of the cockpit, and the reconstruction of events all led to a small switch on the overhead panel, the very one responsible for the pressurization mode. It was in the manual position. That was enough to build the entire chain, and the chain came out like this. At night, the engineer left the pressurization in manual mode and never returned it to auto. In the morning, the crew failed 3 times to notice this during the checks. After takeoff, the cabin didn't pressurize. An alarm sounded, but it sounded exactly like the takeoff configuration warning, and the pilots didn't recognize the real threat. Hypoxia set in, crew and passengers lost consciousness. The plane circled on autopilot until it had burned all its fuel, and it crashed. The medical examination added a particularly grim detail to this story, because the people had spent more than 2.5 hours in an environment nearly devoid of oxygen. By the end of the flight, everyone on board was in a deep, irreversible unconsciousness. The investigation's conclusion was unambiguous, and all the more terrible for it. Not a technical failure, not a storm, not malicious intent. 121 lives were taken by a chain of human lapses, multiplied by an insidious design flaw, 2 different alarms that sounded the same. What remained was to understand what lay behind the lapses, and what all of this would teach aviation. The reckoning was harsh, both for the airline and for the whole industry. The investigation exposed serious questions about procedures, crew training, and maintenance at Helios Airways. Inspections and lawsuits came down on the carrier. Soon the company ceased operations, and the name Helios vanished from the timetables forever. The legal proceedings dragged on for years. Cases were heard in both Cyprus and Greece. Charges were brought against the airline's executives. The families of the dead, in turn, filed suit against Boeing, the maker of the plane. Their main argument struck right at the sore point, that same identical horn for 2 completely different warnings, the one that threw the crew off in the air. That suit was settled out of court. Purely technical conclusions were also drawn from the disaster. In 2011, an airworthiness directive came out. Boeings of the 737 family were required to be fitted with separate, clearly distinguishable warning lights that point unambiguously to a pressurization problem, so that no crew would ever again confuse one alarm for another in the decisive minute. Pilot training changed too. The loss of Flight 522 became a textbook example of hypoxia for everyone learning to fly. Training programs were strengthened when it comes to recognizing oxygen starvation and reacting correctly to depressurization warnings. But behind all the directives and reforms, the main thing remains: 121 lives cut short in the hills outside Athens. Families, children, the crew, and the young flight attendant Andreas Prodromou, who held on alone for an entire plane full of people to the very end and tried to save the doomed. The story of Flight 522 is a bitter lesson in how one switch forgotten on the ground, one similar sound, and a few overlooked seconds of attention can turn an ordinary holiday flight into a silence flying in circles.